In a series with stories set around kingdoms, royalty, and nobility 100% of the time, this series is no stranger to characterizing high society individuals as snobby, classist, and rude to the common folk. As enemy characters, they treat people societally beneath them with contempt and hatred. But the allies are of course another story. This video is going to be a bit different. It's not exactly going to be a video talking about 3 to 4 characters that fit the trope of elitist. Instead, I want to focus more on the trope itself and how this series explores it through its characters while using established elitists as examples. And if you thought this was going to be a video addressing elitism in the player base, sorry, that's not my department. To be in an elite group of nobility is to be superior in terms of ability or qualities, compared to the rest of society. In Fire Emblem, this is often relevant to land-holding nobility, like lords or wealthy houses that stand out from the common folk. Being part of an elite and being an elitist itself is different though. Elitists hold on to the belief that society should be led by them. The common folk need to be served and overseen for society to prosper, but this attitude can often lead to snobbery and classism at the expense to common-born or low society people. Barring fringe cases like Oliver, a character who I somehow always have to mention, if you ask a playable elite character what nobility means to them, they would answer with some form of, I am duty-bound to lead and serve my subjects. But some would tell you that they're simply better than others by birthright, or at the very least, they act that way. There are different tiers of elitism though. Take Echoes, for example. Clive embodies the sympathetic elitist angle. He believes in a class system, but also it's the duty of the nobility to protect the common people. He's not perfect though, and upon learning that Alm isn't actually Lord Myson's grandson, he harbors doubts about his choice to make Alm the leader of the army upon Fernand telling him that he's just a commoner with actually no ties to him whatsoever. He also criticizes Alm's choice to save a village girl, Delthea, but Alm calls him out, questioning whether or not the circumstances would be different if the captive was a noble.
Forgive me if I am out of place. I do not mean to question your leadership. But the purpose of the deliverance is not to save one girl at a time, correct? Sometimes we must examine a situation more dispassionately.
Suppose it wasn't a village maiden. Suppose it was a princess or some noble daughter. Then would you go save her?
Well, that's hardly the same thing.
It's exactly the same thing.
Clive tells Alm that Delthea is not a big priority, but implies it would be if she were a noble. Clive thinks they'd have a moral obligation to rescue a noble-born girl, but rescuing a commoner isn't a good use of their manpower. Fernand is an elitist too, but is very contemptuous towards commoners, and gets so angry at Clive, making Alm the leader of the deliverance, the resistance army that he and the nobility started, that he leaves. Additionally, it is Berkut's view on station that compels him to switch sides.
What nonsense. One is born either noble or common. This destiny cannot be changed. Has a sheep any hope of leading wolves? No.
Yes, exactly. Truer words were never spoken, Lord Berkut.
Of course, Fernand wasn't always like this, and his tragic backstory is the source of his contempt toward villagers, but you get my point. Then you have someone like Lucas, who, while a land-holding lord himself, he wouldn't be considered an elitist. He understands his role as a noble, but doesn't look down on his subjects as lesser because of their station. Nor does he use language that indicates a bias against them, such as using terms like base or lowborn and the like. He never loses faith in Alm, and never looks down upon people like Tobin or Gray. Usually, videos like mine follow a pattern. Introduce the subject of the video. Archetypes, weird characterization, recruitments, stuff like that. Characters from themes I pick are often varied enough in their personality. Shinon, Makalov, and Nasala are all assholes, but they are all completely different assholes. Dedue, Avel, and Jagan are all badasses, but you can be a badass in so many different ways that you can find examples everywhere. In my opinion, I find the elitist trope to be more rigid. Being an elitist usually hits the same beats game to game, and it's not the most redeeming trait to have. It's harder to be sympathetic towards an elitist character than one that isn't. Calling commoners names and claiming superiority because of your birthplace isn't exactly going to win anyone over. Don't get me wrong though in this video. Just having elitist tendencies as a noble in Fire Emblem doesn't mean they're a quote-unquote bad person or a bad character. It's a spectrum. Having an attitude like Berkut, Fernand, the Benyon Senate, or corrupt and comically evil nobles is very often reserved for villains since it's so easy to invoke negative feelings towards them. When we talk about ally characters who invoke those very sentiments through their more formal language or their pompous attitude, or both, they are often played for laughs.
I hail from a little place called Ram Village.
A village? You don't say! That's one of those places with all the cows and the barns and the fields, yes?
Yeah. Something like that.
My word! I hardly ever speak with villagers. What is it like to chase cows every day? I wager they bite, the nasty creatures. And yet you aren't smothered in manure. This is not what I pictured.
Right.
Claire, perhaps you should consider Alm's feelings in regards to his home.
Huh? Oh dear, have I done it again? It's as Clive constantly reminds me. The deliverance is not like the Knights of Zofia. Not every soldier in our ranks is noble, but we must treat them all as equals. The peasant must forgive his lady for this gauche breach of etiquette.
It's all right. The peasant, whose name is Alm, will get over it.
Clarine from FE6 is also a noble with a bit of an elitist streak. She demands to Dorothy that cooking and cleaning is lowly work that someone like Merlinus should be doing. She tells her to speak more refined like she does, and she takes exception to Deke's casual treatment of her. Are you lost? Where are your parents? Do you have any idea who? Yeah, you're the kid of some high-rank nobility, right? That doesn't explain why you're here. Listen in awe. I am Clarine of the Reglay family of Etruria. But she is very similar to Claire in that her intentions are pure. They are both proud ladies who genuinely want to help their allies regardless of where they're from. Clarine wants to help raise Dorothea up. Claire, while completely uninformed as to how the common folk live to the point of comically describing her assumptions of them, isn't intentionally hostile whatsoever, but she clearly has a negative perception of them, unironically thinking that villagers run around chasing cows and kicking themselves filthy with mud. Claire's reaction to Alm's social status is indicative of how Fire Emblem often displays interactions between commoners and elitist nobles though. Commoners play it straight, while the absent-minded noble's self-importance and rudeness has a comedic angle, like what I mentioned earlier. Did you just stop by to look down your nose at me, or was there something else? A noble's nose engages in no such activities. If my turn of phrase offended, I apologize. Forgive me? Aw, come on, Maribel, what is it? Fake? Am I a snob? Is that what you're worried about? That kind of talk never seemed to bother you before. Why now? So I am a snob. Oh, I knew it. I've been thinking a lot of myself and my behavior lately, and you know what? I'm a snob. A sad, inexcusable woman who is proud and vain beyond her station. When you first got here, you wouldn't even look at us normal folk. Yes, but you were all so uncouth, what with the stench of the slum about you. Now see, there it is again. And just when I was starting to think better of you. While Linhardt is a noble himself, part of his characterization is that he's not into the nobility whatsoever and just wants to do what he wants, and is usually taking the piss out on others.
You're always giving it your all, aren't you? Yes, I am. Is there something wrong with that? Of course not. In fact, I rather enjoy your demeanor. You go all out even when others wish you wouldn't. You work hard, inspire the admiration of others, and your dignity as a noble is beyond reproach. I consider it my mission to serve as a guide and a model for other members of the nobility. You've mastered all the important noble skills. You drink tea, talk about how great you are, ride horses. Indeed, I went for a ride earlier today. Is that so? You'll have to tell me about it sometime when I'm not walking away.
Don't get me wrong, I'm not criticizing how this trope is usually presented. In fact, I like it. It's relatable. We are not lords, and I for one am certainly not wealthy. To be blunt, taking shots at the ultra-rich and wealthy is just kind of fun to watch and do? It's the same reason why we make fun of crazy rich actors trying to be relatable during the pandemic. Why it's a little difficult, to say the least, to empathize with people who can buy our house hundreds of times over when they complain at how inconvenienced they are over things so minuscule, or just things that normal everyday people deal with on the regular. Fire Emblem presents nobility in many different ways, from the worst of the worst in the Senate, to the most selfless, grounded, and duty-bound, like Lucas or Ellie would, to those who'd rather relinquish their nobility, like Ephraim or Linhardt, and those who are snobbish and self-important, yet redeemable and duty-bound, like Lawrence and Ferdinand.
I suspect I know what you are referring to. A certain noble who caused a stir at one of the local taverns, correct? For someone of status to make such a scene. What a disgrace.
I thought just the same. A noble ought to hold himself to a higher standard. It is hardly appropriate to drink and mingle with a tavern full of commoners.
Oh, that is not quite what I meant. I do not object to a noble patronizing their local establishments. In fact, I would say such excursions have value.
Is that so? I would be very curious to hear what value you mean exactly. But allow me first to venture a guess. Is it that you suppose it is proper for a noble to bolster a town's wealth with his patronage? If that is your thinking, then I would counter that whatever one adds to a merchant's coffers seldom makes it to the pockets of the townsfolk. I think that if a noble wishes to use his resources to ease the burdens of the commoners, he ought to go about town and spend it more directly.
That is wonderfully insightful, Lawrence. Albeit not what I had in mind. What I meant was this. We can benefit from crossing the threshold and learning more about regular folk. We scarcely understand the reality of their lives. In turn, they do not know about us. I have heard that some believe we have horns growing from our heads. It is an embarrassing and potentially perilous state of affairs.
I also want to talk about Constance. She is a nuanced take of nobility in the series. What makes her particularly interesting is that when the game starts, she isn't a noble at all. She used to be. House Nouvelle of the Empire was a once proud house that was well known for its magical research, but it was destroyed after being turned into a battlefield from the Dagda and Brigid War, and from siding with the Emperor during the Insurrection of the Seven. It was left with nothing. Constance has the heart of a noble and upholds the same values as Lawrence and Ferdinand does, but she has nothing. She can distinguish between what is high society and low society, but isn't in a position to look down upon the common folk as she is one herself. She works night and day to see her house be restored back into the nobility though. Her unique position offers really interesting supports between other nobles and former nobles in the game. Edelgard, Ferdinand, Mercedes, and Yuritsa all benefit from her unique characterization. But is she an elitist though? I don't have a definitive answer right now. Even though she now has nothing to her name, she still values Fodlan's current nobility system and believes it necessary to have, and tirelessly fights for Nouvelle's restoration. Her circumstances are just very different than others, and I'm curious to see what you guys think about that. High society elitists most of the time get on people's nerves, what with the constant flaunting of their self-worth and their status, but unlike many corrupt nobles, they genuinely care about helping and elevating the living situations of those they are supposed to by birthright. For a noble not to have this redeeming trait, you have people like Oliver, who is so irredeemable as an individual that he is instead revered for being a complete meme. The rest, like I mentioned, are usually reserved for being enemies. But maybe in a future game, we can have another playable character for the most hated category, someone who is very self-aware and perceptive of the world, understands his supposed obligation to serve the common folk, but chooses not to do it and to reap the spoils of nobility as the head of a house. I just want to make a quick shout out to Ilios, a commoner in FE5 who so desperately wants to become a noble, but once he actually earns it after the Thracia War, he is so terrible at his job that he gets stripped of all his power and just becomes a figurehead instead. This video is now finished. I want to give a big shout out to my patrons over on my Patreon for their support. You can become a patron yourself by clicking the Patreon link down below. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please leave a like and comment your thoughts on elitism down below. And finally, if you haven't subscribed yet, please consider doing so to be immediately notified of my new scripted Fire Emblem videos just like this. Deuces.